What goes through your mind in the seconds after you jump from an aircraft at 500 feet over enemy territory, when the slipstream tears at your body and the parachute hasn't opened yet, and you're falling through darkness toward a land filled with soldiers who've spent weeks preparing to kill you? When you're 19 years old and you've never been in combat and your equipment weighs nearly as much as you do, and you can hear anti-aircraft fire and see tracer rounds arcing through the night sky, what combination of fear and training and desperate hope keeps you functioning instead of paralyzed? And what does it mean to land in a foreign country in the middle of the night, alone, or with a handful of scattered comrades, knowing that the success of the largest amphibious invasion in history depends partly on paratroopers like you securing objectives before the main force arrives at dawn? I'm 97 years old, and on the night of June 5th to 6th, 1944, I was a 19-year-old private in the 101st Airborne Division who jumped into Normandy as part of Operation Overlord, experienced terror and confusion and desperate fighting through the longest night of my life, and learned what it means to be a paratrooper when everything goes wrong, but the mission still succeeds. This is my story of that descent and that night, of discovering what you're capable of when fear and duty collide and survival depends on training you hoped you'd never have to use. My name is William Robert Morrison, and I was born in a small town in Tennessee in 1925, grew up during the Depression, enlisted in the Army in 1943 as soon as I turned 18 because military service offered opportunities that civilian life in rural Tennessee couldn't match. I volunteered for the paratroopers partly for the extra $50 a month jump pay, and partly because being a paratrooper seemed glamorous and exciting in ways that regular infantry didn't. I went through basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia, completed jump school, earned my silver wings, and was assigned to Company E, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles. We trained intensively through late 1943 and early 1944, learning small unit tactics and weapons, and how to operate behind enemy lines with minimal support, preparing for a mission we knew was coming, but whose details remained classified until the last possible moment. We arrived in England in September 1943, continued training in the English countryside, practiced jumps and live fire exercises, and the coordination required for airborne operations. The training was hard, physically and mentally demanding, but it built confidence and unit cohesion, created bonds between men who'd be depending on each other in combat. My squad consisted of 12 men from all over America, a mix of farm boys and city kids, high school graduates and college dropouts, all of us young and inexperienced but trained to a level that made us believe we could accomplish whatever mission we were given. The briefing for D-Day came on June 4th, when we were finally told the details of Operation Overlord and our role in it. The 101st Airborne Division would drop into Normandy in the hours before the beach landings, would secure causeway exits from Utah Beach, would capture key bridges and destroy German defensive positions, would create chaos behind enemy lines that would facilitate the amphibious assault. Our regiment, the 506th, would drop near Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, would secure causeway exits, would link up with forces landing on Utah Beach. It sounded straightforward in the briefing, a series of clear objectives and tactical plans. But we all understood the reality would be more complicated, that combat never followed the plan, that we'd be jumping into unknown situations with limited information and would have to adapt and improvise. The night of June 5th, we loaded onto C-47 transport aircraft at various airfields across southern England, each plane carrying a stick of paratroopers, about 18 men per aircraft, packed in with our equipment and weapons. I was carrying over 100 pounds of gear. My M1 Garand rifle, ammunition, grenades, rations, water, entrenching tool, gas mask, first aid kit, and all the other equipment deemed necessary for soldiers who'd be operating behind enemy lines with no resupply. The weight was crushing, made movement difficult, turned the simple act of boarding the aircraft into a challenge requiring help from crew chiefs who pushed and pulled us up the steps. The C-47s took off around 2300 hours, formed into massive aerial formations, hundreds of aircraft carrying thousands of paratroopers toward Normandy. Inside our plane, we sat facing each other on canvas seats, too loaded down to move much, trying to process what was coming, trying to maintain the confidence that training had built while confronting the reality that many of us probably wouldn't survive the night. Some men tried to sleep, others prayed, others joked nervously, each dealing with fear in his own way. I sat quietly, checked my equipment repeatedly, thought about my family back in Tennessee, wondered if I'd ever see them again. The flight across the English Channel took about an hour, relatively smooth at first, then increasingly rough as we approached the French coast, and German anti-aircraft fire began targeting the formations. Through the small windows I could see tracer rounds, streams of fire reaching up from the darkness below, beautiful and terrifying simultaneously. The aircraft started taking evasive action, banking and diving, making the ride rough, making men airsick despite the motion sickness pills we'd been given. One man in my stick vomited, the smell adding to the general misery, but there was nothing anyone could do except endure until we reached the drop zone. Around 0100 hours, the red light above the door came on, signal to stand up and hook our static lines to the cable running the length of the aircraft. We stood awkwardly, weighted down by equipment, hooked our lines, checked each other's equipment, prepared to jump. The jump master, a sergeant I'd trained with for months, was at the door checking the terrain below, waiting for the green light that would signal we were over the drop zone. But the anti-aircraft fire was intense. The aircraft was taking evasive action, and I could see through the door that we were lower and faster than we should have been, that the jump conditions were far from ideal. The green light came on, the jump master shouted, "Go!" And we shuffled toward the door as fast as our equipment allowed, each man disappearing into the darkness, the static lines automatically deploying the parachutes as we cleared the aircraft. I was fifth in the stick, had maybe 10 seconds from when the light came on until I reached the door. 10 seconds where everything seemed simultaneously too fast and too slow, where training took over and moved me forward even as my conscious mind was screaming that this was insane. Then I was at the door. The jump master slapped my back and I stepped out into nothing, into darkness and wind and the roar of aircraft engines and the crack of anti-aircraft fire, falling through space while my static line pulled my parachute from its pack. The opening shock was violent, jerked me hard, felt like being hit by a truck, but it meant the parachute had deployed and I wasn't going to crater into the French countryside at terminal velocity. I looked up, confirmed I had a good canopy, looked down to assess where I was landing and immediately realized nothing was going according to plan. We weren't over the drop zone, weren't anywhere I recognized from the maps and photographs we'd studied. The aircraft had been too low and too fast, the evasive action had thrown off navigation, and we'd been scattered across miles of Norman countryside instead of being concentrated near our objectives. I could see other parachutes in the darkness, but not many, certainly not the organized drop that had been briefed. I was going to land alone, or nearly alone, would have to navigate to objectives using only compass and map, would have to find other paratroopers and organize into fighting units capable of accomplishing our missions. The descent seemed to take forever, but probably lasted less than a minute. Time for my mind to race through everything that could go wrong on landing, everything I needed to do to survive the next few seconds. I could see trees below me, knew that landing in trees was dangerous, could mean broken bones or being hung up in the canopy helpless while Germans shot at me. I tried to steer the parachute toward what looked like an open field, pulling on the risers, but the parachute wasn't very maneuverable, and I had limited control over where I'd land. I hit the ground hard, my legs crumpling under me, the impact driving all the air from my lungs, my equipment driving me into the Norman soil. I'd landed in a field that wasn't quite as open as it had looked from above, was actually a hedgerow-divided pasture with 4-foot-high earth embankments topped with vegetation separating small plots. I struggled out of my parachute harness, weapon at the ready, scanning for threats, listening for enemy soldiers who might have seen my descent. The night was full of sounds: distant aircraft, anti-aircraft fire, small arms fire from multiple directions, the occasional explosion, and closer by, the sound of other paratroopers landing and gathering their equipment. I had no idea where I was, couldn't see any landmarks I recognized from the briefings, had no immediate contact with other members of my stick or my company. I was alone in occupied France in the middle of the night, with no clear idea how to reach my objective or link up with my unit. This was the nightmare scenario we'd discussed in training, the situation where the carefully planned operation dissolved into chaos, and individual soldiers had to figure out how to accomplish the mission with whatever resources they could improvise. I checked my equipment, confirmed everything was intact, loaded my rifle with a clip of 8 rounds, and started moving cautiously in what I hoped was the direction of my objective. Navigation was difficult. The Norman hedgerows created a maze that was hard to traverse and harder to map. Visibility was limited to maybe 20 feet, and I had to move slowly to avoid German patrols that might be anywhere. After maybe 30 minutes of cautious movement, I heard the distinctive cricket noise that American paratroopers were using as an identification signal, the metal cricket toy that made a clicking sound, and that would be answered by 2 clicks from another American. I pulled out my cricket, clicked it once, heard 2 clicks in response, and carefully approached the source of the sound. I found 3 other paratroopers from different companies, none of whom I knew. All of us scattered from our units and trying to figure out what to do. We compared maps and locations, determined we were about 2 miles from where we should have landed, established that none of us knew exactly how to reach our assigned objectives, but that we could probably find a way together if we worked as a team. This was the genius of airborne training showing itself. Even though we were from different units with different missions, we'd all received the same basic training, all understood small unit tactics, all knew how to function as a team, even with strangers. Over the next hour, our ad hoc squad grew to 7 men as we encountered other scattered paratroopers, a mix of 101st and 82nd Airborne soldiers who'd been even more scattered than we were. We had 1 lieutenant among us, a young officer from the 82nd who took command by virtue of rank, and who decided our best course of action was to head toward the sound of heaviest fighting, on the theory that wherever American forces were concentrated would be where we could link up with larger units and contribute to the mission. It wasn't elegant strategy, but it made sense given our lack of information and resources. We moved through the hedgerows using fire team tactics, leapfrogging between positions, maintaining security, engaging German patrols when we encountered them, and avoiding them when possible. The fighting was constant, small engagements that would last a few minutes and then we'd move on, never staying in one place long enough to become targets for German artillery or reinforcements. We killed German soldiers, took casualties ourselves, picked up more scattered paratroopers, and gradually moved toward what we hoped were American-held positions. Dawn came around 600 hours, light slowly revealing the Norman countryside and showing us for the first time the full scope of what we'd accomplished. Paratroopers were everywhere, small groups like ours conducting operations throughout the German rear area, creating exactly the kind of chaos and disruption that the mission had called for. We weren't organized, weren't following the original plan, weren't accomplishing the specific objectives we'd been briefed on, but we were behind German lines, were attacking their positions, were forcing them to divert resources to deal with us, were softening the defenses that the beach landing forces would encounter in a few hours. By mid-morning, our group of 7 had grown to about 25 men, a full platoon of scattered paratroopers from multiple units who'd come together through circumstance and necessity. We'd reached a causeway exit, one of the key objectives, and established defensive positions to hold it against German counterattacks. The fighting was intense, Germans recognizing the strategic importance of the causeway and trying to recapture it before the beach forces could use it. But we held, reinforced by more paratroopers throughout the day, eventually linking up with forces coming off Utah Beach in the afternoon. The operation had been chaotic, hadn't followed the plan, had scattered units across miles of terrain instead of concentrating them near objectives. But it had worked, had accomplished the mission despite, or perhaps because of the chaos, had proven that well-trained paratroopers could adapt and improvise and function effectively even when everything went wrong. Historians would later call the airborne operations on D-Day a success despite the scattered drops, would cite the chaos we created behind German lines as contributing significantly to the successful beach landings. But for those of us who'd lived through it, who'd jumped into darkness and landed alone and fought scattered through the night, the success came at tremendous cost. The 101st Airborne Division suffered over 1,200 casualties on D-Day, killed and wounded and missing, more than 10% of the division's strength lost in one night. Many of those casualties were men who'd landed in the wrong places, who'd been isolated and captured or killed, who'd drowned in flooded fields that German forces had deliberately created as obstacles to airborne operations, who'd been shot while descending or while hung up in trees unable to defend themselves. I survived D-Day with only minor injuries, fought through the Normandy campaign and into Holland during Operation Market Garden, survived the Battle of the Bulge at Bastogne, came home in late 1945 after the war in Europe ended. But I was changed, marked by that night and by the months of combat that followed, carrying memories and trauma that would affect me for the rest of my life. The descent into Normandy, those seconds of falling through darkness toward enemy territory, became the defining moment of my war experience, the point where everything theoretical became terrifyingly real, where I discovered what I was capable of when survival and duty demanded it. The question I've pondered for 79 years is what it was about that descent, about those moments between leaving the aircraft and landing on French soil, that made it so significant. Part of it was the vulnerability, being completely exposed while descending, unable to fight back or take cover, utterly dependent on a fabric canopy to slow my fall and on luck to avoid enemy fire. Part of it was the commitment, stepping out that door knowing there was no turning back, no changing my mind, no way out except to complete the mission or die trying. Part of it was the isolation, landing scattered and alone instead of with my unit, having to navigate and fight without the support systems I'd trained with and depended on. But mostly, I think, it was about discovering what I was made of, learning in the most dramatic way possible what I could endure and accomplish when pushed to my absolute limits. That descent stripped away everything comfortable and familiar, put me in a situation where only training and will and desperate determination could save me, forced me to function at a level I'd never achieved before and hoped I'd never have to achieve again. I discovered I was braver than I'd thought, more adaptable than I'd known, more capable of violence and survival than I'd imagined. That knowledge has shaped everything that came after, has been both burden and source of pride for 8 decades. I'm 97 years old now, one of the last surviving paratroopers from D-Day, one of the few who can still bear first-hand witness to what happened that night. Most of my generation is gone, taken by time after surviving the war, and soon I'll join them. But before I go, I wanted to tell this story one more time, to preserve some small record of what that descent meant and what we accomplished despite the chaos and the fear and the terrible cost. The paratroopers' descent isn't just about the physical act of jumping from an aircraft and floating to Earth under a parachute. It's about the psychological and spiritual descent into combat, into situations that test everything you believe about yourself, into experiences that change you forever, whether you survive them or not. We descended into Normandy as boys and came up as something else, as men who'd seen and done things that would mark us permanently, as soldiers who'd proven we could function in the worst conditions imaginable. If this story moved you, if it helped you understand what paratroopers experienced on D-Day and what that descent meant to the boys who became men between the aircraft and the ground, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe to hear more stories from World War II veterans. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Remember the paratroopers who jumped into darkness over Normandy, who fought scattered through that longest night, who secured the objectives that made the beach landings possible. Remember that courage isn't the absence of fear but the willingness to act despite fear, that training and will can triumph over chaos and impossible odds, that sometimes the plans fail, but the mission succeeds anyway because determined soldiers refuse to quit. Thank you for listening to this old paratrooper's memories of the descent that defined his life and the night when everything changed forever.